And joining me now in the studio is Dr. Melih Çoban, who is a lecturer at Marmara University Department of Sociology, and from London, Dr. Robert Rolfs, who is a criminologist at Manchester Metropolitan University. Thank you both for joining me today. Dr. Çoban, I'll start with you here in Istanbul. What's led to the rise in the use of bonsai in Turkey?
Yeah. Actually, the existence of bonsai, or in other words, synthetic marijuana in the Turkish drugs market does not have a long history as it is in most countries all around the world. It entered the Turkish drug market in something like 2009 and 2009 and 2010, sorry, and after that it has undergone through a highly rapid popularization, and so there was a huge decrease in the stock of natural marijuana, which has a long history in Turkey due to its consumption. In other words, we can say that marijuana is a traditional drug in the history of Turkey, which has been consumed for long years in these lands. But as the stock of marijuana decreased due to these narcotic operations, the users and addicts had to find something new.
Well, I know people have turned to bonsai as supposedly an alternative to marijuana, but bonsai is highly addictive
drug,
and very dangerous. What sort of treatment options are available in Turkey for people who use and are addicted to bonsai?
Yeah, there are lots of, there are lots of campaigns held in the public against the use of bonsai, consumption of synthetic marijuana in Turkey. Apart from that, state-backed institutions such as Ematem are also applying programs for addicts and users in order to make them quit the consumption of bonsai and other synthetic marijuana derivatives.
I want to bring in Dr. Robert Rolfs, who's standing by in London for us, because Dr. Rolfs, I know that bonsai appeared in Europe before it made its way into Turkey. How have the European markets tackled bonsai use?
Well, I think we've seen a significant change since it first emerged in countries like the UK and Poland in the late 2000s. So we've around about 10 years now of its being used. And originally, it was popular amongst young people, and it was seen as a kind of a legal alternative to traditional forms of cannabis. But what we're seeing then was what was referred to as the first generation of synthetic cannabinoids. Which was seen to be around about 10 times the strength, the potency of traditional forms of cannabis. Then we've moved into the second generation, which was seen to be around about 100 times the strength. And in the last couple of years, we're into what's been referred to as the third generation of these cannabinoids, which are now reportedly as much as 700 to 800 times more potent than traditional cannabis. So I think what we've learned is, where we originally referred to it as a synthetic cannabis or a legal form of cannabis, now when you speak to users, and many of them have had a history of crack cocaine and heroin and opioid dependency, they quite often refer to it as being the most addictive substance that they've ever used.
Right, so what sort of treatment options then are available for addicts in Europe?
Well, one of the big debates is whether you actually need new forms of treatment for these substances or whether you can still use the traditional forms. And I think really what services in the UK have done, they will still use the same forms of motivational interviewing, trying to get people to identify the triggers for use, trying to get them to reduce the use and to reduce more sensibly and use a harm reduction approach. But the problem that we're finding is that, especially with your kind of so-called problematic user group, your traditional heroin user group, for example, they would typically associate treatment with receiving a substitute medication such as methadone, or they would go to treatment services to get clean needles if they were injecting drugs. And because these drugs are kind of smokable, it's not seen as being addictive, it's seen more in line with cannabis. The problem isn't in terms of what the treatment offer is, it's actually getting people through the door into treatment.
All right, I want to turn back to Dr. Çoban in the studio with me. How successful is rehabilitation in Turkey?
Actually, when we look at the official reports by certain institutions, the number of addicts who are applying for such treatment and rehabilitation programs are increasing day by day. Also, there is another evidence which we can conclude from especially the news in the public, such as starting with especially 2012 onwards, nearly every day we could run into something new in the newspapers, such as another bonsai death. Bonsai deaths has become a very important phenomenon within the Turkish public, especially in the recent years. And the death news have decreased to a certain extent, especially in the last year. This is also another evidence through which we can conclude that the use of bonsai has been decreasing, especially in the last year.
All right, certainly a lot more to talk about, but we are out of time, so we'll have to leave it there. Dr. Robert Relfs in London and Dr. Melih Çoban here in the studio with me in Istanbul. Thank you to the both of you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.